So I recently finished marathoning all of Martin Scorsese's movies, and though I didn't embark on this little viewing series for a video essay, I nonetheless formed some opinions. This video will be a bit different from some of the other work I've done, with less of a refined and straightforward thesis, and more a hodgepodge collection of disparate Martin Scorsese hot takes. Starting with the titular, The Age of Innocence is a masterpiece. Scorsese's telling of repressed romance and yearning certainly had its champions in 1993, but was largely ignored, with Marty criticized for not staying in his lane. My own attitude wasn't much better on first viewing, but a rewatch really changed my tune. This is honestly one of Scorsese's best movies. Purely on an aesthetic level, The Age of Innocence is deeply rewarding, with its vibrant color palette, richly detailed production design, and lavish cinematography. But as beautiful as these visuals are, they also become stifling, with the elegant sets and costumes acting as prisons for characters unable to act on their feelings. The film's first two acts delicately develop the romance between Newland Archer and Countess Olenska, along with the social pressures which keep them apart. Daniel Day-Lewis and Michelle Pfeiffer's guarded yet sensitive performances draw us in, setting us up for a third act blindside which reveals just how naive Newland has been from the start. For as un-Scorsese-like as The Age of Innocence may seem, the film also makes for a fascinating companion piece to Mean Streets. New York stories of characters torn between who they love and the pressures of conformity. So if you dismiss The Age of Innocence at first brush, give it another shot. Alright, let's keep the positive vibes going with hot take number 2. The 2010s may be the best decade of Scorsese's career. I'm leaving some room for doubt given Scorsese's 70s run, which first established him as a major artist, is probably more important, but in terms of the movies themselves, the 2010s are near perfect. Shutter Island gets a lot of shit for its ending.
Why are you all wet, baby?
And, rightfully so, but the film is still a masterpiece of atmosphere, thanks to its haunting setting, deep cast of creepy supporting actors, and some really fantastic sound design. Also, the flashbacks and dream sequences, which are some of my favorite scenes Scorsese has ever done. With The Wolf of Wall Street, Scorsese dropped an epic comedy that for my money is the funniest movie of the decade, a scathing indictment of how rich white guys can basically get away with anything. Certainly timely. Also, this part.
As you can probably guess, I fucked her goddamn brains out.
Jesus Lord.
For 11 seconds.
Did you just come?
Oh yeah, I just came.
Following Sin with Penance, Silence is the best of Scorsese's spiritual epics, both a deeply moving personal story of faith in crisis and a contemplation on how religion intersects with nationalism and politics. There's honestly volumes to say regarding if the film sees faith as a blessing or a curse, as well as how Rodriguez's journey reflects Scorsese's own conflicted spirituality. And of course, there's The Irishman, Scorsese's death-soaked eulogy for the gangster film and an honest attempt to grapple with mortality. A film that uses cutting-edge digital technology and the full scope of Scorsese's craft, built on 50 years of filmmaking, to tell a story of quiet intimacy. There's a lot of variety in these movies, but all four show a master at the height of his craft and an energetic passion for filmmaking that's frankly astounding for a man in his 70s. But you may have noticed a glaring omission in my decade recap, and that's because Hugo is Scorsese's most frustrating movie. It isn't the worst. That spot's likely forever reserved for Boxcar Bertha. I use frustrating because, at its best, Hugo is a moving celebration of cinema and a testament to the importance of film preservation. The flashbacks to Georges Méliès making movies are pure wonder. Unfortunately, Hugo is also a middling kids movie about a generic Dickensian orphan with daddy issues, full of juvenile humor. I'll grant that these elements might just be a matter of taste that don't appeal to me, but either way, the screenplay doesn't do a very good job bridging these halves. The central problem is the relationship between Hugo and Georges Méliès. This should be the heart of the movie, but it's barely any more developed than the romance between Emily Mortimer's Flower Girl and Borat the Train Inspector. George just seems like an unreasonable asshole to Hugo. Then we find out that he's Georges Méliès, devastated by the destruction of his art. But then discussing his work rekindles some passion and he ends up adopting Hugo. Then we cut ahead later to a bunch of Méliès films being rediscovered. In theory, these characters and their stories do intersect. Hugo is looking for a father figure, and George needs someone to breathe life back into him. The problem is that these characters never come together the way they should. The two simply don't have enough scenes together to build a meaningful relationship. So here's what I would have done. Amalgamate the two child characters into one protagonist. The relationship with George Méliès needs to be at the heart of the movie, and while Chloe Moretz's performance is a bright spot in the film, these scenes draw focus away from the core. Have the inciting incident be George catching Hugo stealing from his shop and deciding the boy must work to pay back his debt. From there, we actually see Hugo and George working together, fixing things and getting to know each other. The two become friends. That way, when Hugo uncovers George's painful past and George says this,
You're cruel.
it actually means something, because it's between characters whose relationship the audience has invested in. This also puts the discovery of George's past as a piece of the developing story between the two characters, initially drawing a rift between the two, but ultimately bringing them closer. I'd also bring the ensemble cast more to the forefront of the story. The film has this deep roster of excellent character actors, but most of them don't really do anything. They're just kinda there. But what if they were actually involved in the story, with Hugo and George helping these background characters out while working in their little shop? Then at the end, instead of jumping ahead to a bunch of Méliès films being discovered, maybe the various personalities at the station could play some role in helping find the films. I think this ties into the theme of cinema as communal activity more strongly, and it also provides more narrative payoff. Now, these screenplay suggestions aren't exactly brilliant revisions, but I do think they more cleanly focus the themes Scorsese is interested in a tighter story. Because it's pretty cool that Marty made a $150 million kids movie that's really a love letter to silent movies, but in its present state, Hugo is pretty sloppy. Alright, that was pretty negative. Let's change gears. Get it? Because Hugo fixes clock. New York, New York isn't actually that bad. Scorsese's epic, old Hollywood-inspired musical is one of the director's few movies to be considered an outright failure. But that isn't totally fair. I mean, it's certainly better than Spielberg's late 70s cocaine-fueled extravagance. New York, New York is at least highly ambitious, attempting to merge old Hollywood glamour with new Hollywood grit at both a narrative and aesthetic level. The film's biggest flaw is a lack of balance, particularly in the romantic aspects. The film cribs the meet-cute and aggressive courting of old Hollywood romances, but here, that courtship begets a deeply toxic relationship. The problem is that Jimmy is so transparently shitty that the audience is 10 steps ahead of the movie. The toxicity of the relationship is apparent, and never a reveal. But on the other hand, Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli both give great performances, and scenes like the rehearsal are loaded with tension. Additionally, the film's merger of old and new aesthetics is frankly fantastic. The stylized New York sets are mesmerizing and make for an ironic contrast with the more realistic and even grim story. This culminates in the final act, with Scorsese putting forth a series of extravagant musical numbers full of that old Hollywood moxie, building towards a quietly bittersweet ending. Now, this would probably all work better if we could invest in the central romance, but even so, the ending is still pretty strong. So yeah, New York, New York, it's not that bad. And speaking of things that are not that bad, Cameron Diaz gets way too much shit for Gangs of New York. There's a prevailing attitude that Cameron Diaz gives an awful performance in Gangs of New York, but I really don't think that's fair. Rewatching the film, Diaz is fine. She does a good job putting forth a facade of playfulness that masks a more calculating intelligence. Her accent is maybe a little shaky, but honestly, I can't really tell and I don't really care. The real issue isn't Diaz, it's the writing of her character, a byproduct of a generally sloppy screenplay. Jenny and her romance with Valen just feels deeply tangential to the story, and both characters pale in comparison to Daniel Day-Lewis's fascinating and sadistic Bill the Butcher. This all stems from a bigger issue with Gangs of New York. The film is way more interested in its setting than its story. Valen's quest for revenge is really just a thin framework for Scorsese to explore 19th century New York, and Jenny inevitably gets caught up in that. But aim your criticisms away from Diaz, because she really doesn't deserve the blame. Scorsese's Jesus is the most interesting Jesus in film history. I say most interesting because I don't have the theological background to declare what's best, but the Jesus of The Last Temptation of Christ is far and away the most compelling take on the Son of God I've ever seen on film. In most movies, Jesus is pretty boring as a character. The character is usually presented as a peerless paragon of virtue with an unshakable commitment to his mission. And that makes sense, but as far as film protagonists go, that doesn't give a lot to work with. He's already perfect, so there's no real arc, and he's so sure of himself that there's little room for drama. Consequently, many extravagant biblical epics are dreadfully boring. Even a more irreverent take, like the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, centers most of its drama on Judas, who really steals the show.
Your followers are blind. Too much heaven on their minds.
Some movies have gotten around this problem by making Jesus more of a periphery character, whereas something like The Passion of the Christ focuses more on the visceral experience rather than Jesus as a person. But in depicting the life of Christ in human rather than divine terms, Scorsese is able to make a movie no one else had ever made. A character study of Jesus Christ. The Jesus of Last Temptation is riddled with insecurity and fear. He's unsure of himself, not just his abilities, but also his desires. This Jesus not only doesn't know if he really is the Son of God, but if he even wants to be. Crucial to this portrayal is Willem Dafoe's performance. Where other Jesuses were more symbol than character, Dafoe brings a sense of urgency that makes for a far more relatable character. His Jesus not a holy symbol of divinity, but a fallible person, full of fear. These layers of doubt are crucial to the film's climax, where the titular Last Temptation of Christ plays out before our eyes, as Jesus contemplates forgoing his sacrifice to live a life of earthly pleasures, before ultimately rejecting this temptation to die on the cross. This characterization is what drove the controversy against the film back in 1988, but it's also what makes The Last Temptation of Christ so rewarding. The film is able to offer an insightful character study that no cinematic vision of the life of Christ had before or since, and it also makes his sacrifice all the more meaningful. It is in rejecting his own desires to serve a greater good that Jesus' sacrifice in The Last Temptation of Christ becomes more than adherence to the text, but a hard-fought victory for a character who struggled with doubt. Okay, let's finish this off by looking at another Scorsese main character. Rupert Pupkin is Scorsese's most disturbing protagonist. This echoes comments Scorsese himself has made, and it may seem a bit peculiar. In a filmography full of flat-out killers, Rupert never physically hurts anyone. Even when he kidnaps his idol, Jerry Langford, he only uses a prop gun. But what makes Rupert so unnerving is his motivations and lack of empathy. For all the horrible things Scorsese's gangsters may do, they're also motivated by a very relatable desire for money and success. They're seduced by their greed, but their initial desire to escape from working class limitations is understandable, and even admirable. But Rupert is different. His desire for fame and glory is driven entirely by spite, with Rupert showing open contempt for those he feels are beneath him. Nowhere is this more apparent than Rupert's fantasies, which show him triumphing over those who doubted him.
When Rupert here was a student at Clifton High School, none of us dreamt that he would amount to a hill of beans. But we were wrong. And you, Rupert, you were right.
Winning over the woman that doesn't respect him, and basking in the adoration of the celebrity who won't pay him attention. He's not trying to make money or accomplish something challenging, he's trying to put people in their place. Rupert's goal is to hurt people. And this reflects Rupert's lack of empathy. Empathy is at the forefront of many Scorsese films. It's why we're able to invest so much in characters who do such harmful things. For as cruel as Scorsese's heroes may be, we still see glimmers of compassion. Henry really loved his friends. Ace loved Ginger. Frank loved Jimmy and Russ. Even Jordan Belfort, perhaps Scorsese's most boastfully amoral protagonist, still shows real affection, to the point that it's almost moving.
She asked for a $5,000 advance just so she could pay his son's tuition. What'd I do, Kimmy?
You wrote me a check for $25,000.
That's right.
Compounding this is a deep sense of guilt with Scorsese protagonists being torn apart by their own violent actions. Not everyone, mind you. Sometimes a lack of guilt is in fact the point, but guilt is a pretty consistent theme in Scorsese's work. Most recently, the final act of The Irishman sees Frank tormented by a life of sin as it all comes crashing down. We can see this mixture of compassion and guilt in the king of comedy's closest analog, Taxi Driver, another story of a lonely white guy lashing out at the society which rejects him. But for all the ways he may fail, Travis does genuinely try to make a connection with others, and by the end of the film, cares deeply about saving Iris, misguided though he may be. The character is also perpetually tormented by his own harmful thoughts and feelings, and Travis does make efforts to improve. One of the most important scenes in the film sees Travis going to a wizard for advice. This comes after Betsy's rejection, and Travis enduring the homicidal fantasies of a deranged fair. By now, Travis is at a low point, where he's starting to reckon with the violence he's capable of.
I really want to I got some bad ideas in my head. I just...
Wizard's lack of meaningful advice helps contribute to Travis's downward spiral, but all the same, it's crucial that Travis felt guilty about his violent thoughts and attempted to make a positive change. This combination of compassion and guilt is what makes Travis an empathetic character, and it's these key features which are so lacking in Rupert Pupkin. Rupert doesn't actually care about any of the people in his life. Masha and Jerry's employees are only valued for what they can do for Rupert, while Jerry and Rita are only desired for the adoration they can give. In both cases, Rupert never sees people as people, and guilt never even enters his purview, with Rupert lacking the self-awareness to even see his actions as harmful. The character is nearly earnest in his commitment, and it's easy to think the story is building to some comeuppance. But that's not what happens.
There is no doubt that the incident has made the name Rupert Pupkin a household word.
Officials estimate that Rupert Pupkin's performance has been viewed by a record 87 million American households.
Rupert is rewarded. He gets everything he wanted, precisely through kidnapping and extortion. And it's that added layer which makes the King of Comedy and Rupert Pupkin so unnerving. It isn't just that the film depicts the deranged fantasies of a disillusioned white guy, but that it shows one such fantasy coming true. We spend the King of Comedy laughing at Rupert Pupkin, but by film's end, Scorsese reveals that the joke was always on us.